Hello, Amanda and Amber.
Hi.
All right. Sorry, I keep unconventional hours. I stayed up really, really late and I just woke up. I'm trying to wake my brain up.
I know you stayed up late because you were grading my stuff right after I turned it in.
This is great, though, to have you guys. Anyone else who comes on, please make sure that I give you credit. I give you extra credit for being here. Okay, so I have Amber and Amanda so far. All right. So this week for History 101, we're doing the Constitution. And so, first of all, because I always get really nervous on this assignment because it's different from the others. So I have to rely upon my written instructions. Did I make it clear to you guys as far as what I'm expecting on this one?
I was a bit confused, but I also just got to it last night.
Uh huh.
I'm behind on a couple of things that I missed.
It's okay. It's okay. Um, yeah, just keep in contact with me and Canvas message me or my second phone number, and I will under special circumstances, I'm cutting students slack and not deducting points. So, and even if I do deduct points, usually if you do a good job, I usually still give you a 40 out of 50. Uh,
Yeah, I,
or, yes.
I was gonna ask to talk to you after class because I emailed you like last week and you didn't respond. So
Oh, shoot. Yeah, because
yeah.
did you do it, Amber? Did you do it through Canvas message?
No, I actually did it over the school
The
email
standard email.
because
I'm
that's just
so sorry. I'm behind on those. Yeah,
yeah.
I
It's okay.
I take for granted. I mean, I need to prioritize and do Canvas message and my text first, but that doesn't mean I should be behind on my emails either. I apologize.
It's
Uh,
okay. Well,
that's the case. Yeah.
now I know that if you would rather I talk to you over Canvas, like when I need something
Yeah,
or
I
whatever.
would, but like I said, that doesn't get me off the hook. I need to catch up on my regular standard emails as well. So I'm sorry for that. Um, but yeah, absolutely. We'll catch up, okay, Amber?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. The least I can do. So so let's see here. So with this assignment, right, for this week, anything enlightened, right, that you find throughout the three articles. The first is the legislative, and they intended that symbolically, because when you have a republic, right, remember it's a mixed government. It's some offices that are directly elected by the people. It's some offices that are insulated from the popular will, and you know, three different branches, obviously. They wanted to do the first one, the representative body, right? Cover the House first. And so that was symbolic. That was the most important, that if you had any in the Republic, any offices outweigh the others. That there wasn't really consensus on this, but it's the final product, nevertheless, that it would err more on the side of the Democratic side, but again, that's arguable, as I'll get into some stuff today. So at any rate, you have the legislator first, right, who passes the laws, Congress. Then the second one, you have the executive, the president, and then the third, you have the judiciary, the Supreme Court. So and then you have the first 10 amendments, right, known as the Bill of Rights. So, looking at that, anything that is tied in to something that is tied to the Enlightenment, you'd put under a category of enlightened. So, for instance, with the Enlightenment, they're for popular sovereignty, right? Sovereignty is like, to me, it's like authority. When you have someone down, you have power over that person. But whenever that person throws you off, metaphorically, you no longer have that power. To me, authority is when the person doesn't fight back and accepts your power, right? And so, authority, where does authority arise from? Well, it was very popular in the Enlightenment that authority arises from the consent of the people themselves, right? So, anything in which rulers are held accountable would, I think, arguably be an enlightened component to this Constitution, right? So anything in which they have to show transparency, and Congress has to show who votes yay and nay on what, and what was discussed in Congress, and it needs to be disclosed to the public. That would be an enlightened facet to the Constitution. Anything clearly that's elected, any offices that is elected, is an enlightened component to the Constitution. Um, Also, checks and balances, right? Montesquieu during the Enlightenment. So anytime Congress has to get, both houses, one house is popularly elected, the other one is not. They both have to pass a law, to have a majority uh, pass the law. And then it also goes over to the president to be signed or vetoed. That's a check, right? But they could override that veto with a 2/3 majority. That's a power they have as a check against the president to still pass a popular law. Um, the president being able to um, well, I don't want to get into that just yet. That's conservative. But at any rate, that's what I mean by enlightened. Anything with accountability, anything with the people's consent, anything whereby powers cannot run untrammeled, right? Where someone in any of any of the branches, the three branches, cannot just do as he or she pleases. I would arguably put that under enlightened. And I would love, because sometimes students will put something under a category that I subjectively initially disagree with. And when you give a sentence, just one sentence, um, describing why you put that in that category, sometimes I literally learn from you guys, from the students, and I think, man, I never thought of that way, and that's an intelligent point. So that's why I ask that you put the article down under enlightened, and then you just give me one sentence as to why you put it under enlightened, right? So House of Reps, right? Um, you could put down a few articles under enlightened and say these are enlightened because they must live in the place where they represent. So hence they'll be held accountable and they'll know what it's like to live in that area, right? And so this is direct representation, what we fought for in the quote revolution and the war for independence, rather than virtual representation by well-to-do men who know nothing what it's like to live in that district. So at any rate, just give me a brief description as to why you put it under that category. Um, Conservative, conservative is anything that has been, for instance, right? There were at least two kind of axioms, right? Assumptions that were taken for granted as it was just common sense that everybody took for granted. You don't even question. There were at least two axioms about the need for this government, right? And one was an enlightened axiom, and that was government exists to protect our liberties, right? Remember the social contract? Remember the idea of the social contract is that uh, um, Rousseau and Locke and others wrote about the hypothetical beginnings of government. And what they thought philosophically was perhaps initially mankind lived in a state of nature. He lived just free as can be. Everyone was like a roaming hunter gatherer uh, and just doing as he or she pleased, right? And so I liken it to like if we were to take a trip, like if you've seen the oh gosh, what's that book? I'm going back to high school in the early 90s here, aging myself. But Lord of the Flies, right? Let's say we were going on a trip and we suddenly had a problem with the airplane and we became marooned on an island as a class. So all of us began perhaps hypothetically in a state of nature. We're all doing as we please. We go and hunt and fish. We're trying to use our cell phones to get help and give some kind of SOS call for a plane to see us, light a fire, etc. Right? But then in the state of nature, they kind of surmised is perhaps some enough people began to abuse that freedom, right? And human nature being what it is. Because even with the Enlightenment, all its optimism, they still were pretty cynical at that time period about human nature, that people will abuse their freedom. Many people will, if they had complete freedom, that there an element of chaos would ensue. So then let's say we're on that island and some people start extorting people and saying, you know what, I'm going to beat you up if you don't fish for me and catch me 3 fish to eat today. Or while you're sleeping, someone takes theft, someone takes your cell phone and swears that he or she doesn't have it. And so what they surmised was eventually people got to a stage where they did the cost benefit analysis, right? And they said, man, I really love my freedom, but it's even heavier, the abuses of that freedom. People are stealing my stuff. They're extorting people. People are getting violent. Uh, and so something needs to be done. So they got to the stage where they grudgingly agreed, let's say hypothetically in these books by Rousseau and Locke during the Enlightenment, that that their absolute freedom was not worth it. That they were willing to curtail, to cut short their freedoms so that they could feel safety, right? So they hypothetically decide on a government. So let's say there's, we have a pretty large class, but let's say, 70, 80 of us, and we get together and we have like a popular convention, and we decide democratically 50% plus one on a crew of about a dozen students that are going to be our rulers, our leaders, right? But to them, they're not rulers in the sense that they could lord power over us, right? Because that's what we're trying to avoid. They are our servants. They are there to protect us and to keep our natural rights protected so we can continue to be as free as possible, but just have our stuff protected, have our persons and safety protected, right? And so we give our permission for them to rule over us. And the moment they cease to do a good job and our liberties are at in peril, we decide, you know what, you're not doing your job, and we have the right to alter or abolish that government. And we get back together and we choose 12 new people, completely 12 others, right, to try the job again. That to me is the social contract. It's the idea that, because remember, with the Enlightenment, everything which is natural is good. They were largely in their philosophical foundation, they were deist, believing that God was like a clockmaker and he made everything by natural laws. And whatever abides by those natural laws is good and healthy and is best for mankind. So at any rate, they believed that government, if it left to its natural purpose, is to be our servant and to protect our liberties as much as possible. So that clearly is that as an axiom that the founding fathers were living under. They believed that was a central part of government was to ensure our liberties as much as possible. But on the other hand, right, even these writers attested that when you agree to this government, you are agreeing to the curtailment, the cutting short of some of your liberties. The government is a necessary evil, right? And so you're not going to have the complete freedom to do whatever you want, right? I think of laws like someone playing excessively loud music at 1:30 in the morning. You have a right to call the police on them, and the police can come and say, hey, you've abused your liberty. You need to turn your music down. You're infringing on the rights of your neighbors to be able to sleep. That might have been a poor example, but you know what I mean? That there's an extent to which my exercise of my liberty can infringe upon, I could step on your feet, metaphorically, and infringe upon your liberties in exercising my own. So at any rate, there was also conservative axiom that said we need to have law and order, that government is, the conservatives are not completely wrong, that to a certain extent, for some people, government is meant to be a straitjacket, right? Those straitjackets that they put people that were supposedly out of control in the asylums or in prisons, put them in a jacket so they can't harm anybody else. So at any rate, anything, going back to the conservative argument, anything that is in the name of law and order, is in the name of having a centralized strong power, to me that would be considered conservative. That was an old school way of thinking. That's the way human history has been to a large extent when you look at different civilizations and global history. And so hence, right, giving a lot of power to the central government. For instance, Article 1, Section 8. When you look at Article 1, Section 8 under Congress, it says Congress shall have the power to do these things. Many of the things on that list were not given to Congress when we had a confederation, right? And so they gave a much stronger government in this new government that we have, this republic, right? So only government can make treaties and declare war and raise an army and put down rebellions and then just practical stuff as well as on that list. but some of them for sure I would consider subjectively conservative, right? Because it's in the name of keeping good public order and having the opposite of chaos, right? Of having a strong semblance of the general welfare, what's good for the safety of the majority of people. And sometimes, right, liberty and safety are on opposite sides of the spectrum as far as what different factions want. So that would be an example of conservative, giving a lot of power to Congress. Another example would be having several unelected offices, right, that are not directly elected by the people. So for instance, look at the House reps, then you have the upper house, the Senate, then you have the executive, which is comprised of the president, vice president, cabinet, and ministers, right? Then you also have the Supreme Court. So of those four, right, how many of those four are directly elected by citizens? Only one, if you've noticed. Only the House reps are directly elected by citizens in their states. One out of four. That's not that democratic, is it? Right? Because you look at the senators, at first, not any longer, but according to this original constitution, they're elected by the state legislators. So that's one step removed from the people, right? The people vote for their state legislators, but then those people they voted for vote for the senators. That's one step removed from the people. The president, right, and vice president, the electoral college. You get enough electoral points to the number of congressmen that you have in your state, and they were actual people, these electors, so that those electors would vote for the president. And we have gone the tradition, right, that whoever wins the majority of popular votes, that party's electors get to go vote at the state capitol for the president in their state. And so technically, and it's happened before, the popular vote has been ignored, and an elector went and an elector voted for another party, another candidate who did not win the popular vote. So the electoral college is a step removed from popular vote. And then also, of course, the Supreme Court, the most aristocratic. Remember, aristoi means the best, people that don't pretend to need to be popular, but that they're the best qualified and hence put in that job by a hand-picked process. The Supreme Court judges, as we're seeing now, right, are selected unilaterally by the president. But of course, a somewhat enlightened condition upon that is that the Senate, with the 2/3, must approve of that choice. So the Supreme Court are handpicked and for life, right? So they don't have to worry about making popular decisions. So though that component to our Constitution, I would argue, is very conservative. It's not very democratic, right? And so that would be another example. So let's see here. So yeah, so conservative category, and then we have pragmatic. And to me, pragmatic is amoral. It's not considering what you think is right or wrong. It's just a practical decision that is supposed to bring about practical good results. And I didn't articulate that well at all, but I hope that I conveyed something in saying that. So for instance, right, to me, you could also put it as conservative, but I might argue that slavery, the implicit acceptance of slavery, was a pragmatic decision. They knew that Randolph and others in the representing this and Pinckney representing the southern states, these guys at the Constitutional Convention, they were very adamant that they would not be okay with this unless there were a property clause in here that says whatever you by law own today before we make this new government, you own tomorrow. And of course, they have the gag rule saying that Congress cannot even take the floor and discuss the slave trade and slavery until 1808. So they put a 20-year gag rule on slavery. They have a fugitive slave clause that you may have found in here that said that anybody under a labor contract who runs away to another state is to be returned to the rightful owner and to the rightful state. So that clearly implicitly accepts slaves, right? Another pragmatic thing that they did is some people wanted universal, and you could also, again, say this is conservative, and that's fine. But citizenship, the Enlightenment, right, was about natural rights of all human beings. You're entitled to your rights because you are a human being, distinct from other, quote, animals. And hence, if they followed that to its conclusion, they should have universal enfranchisement or citizenship. All human beings should have been given citizenship. But that was way too far, obviously, for the Southern representatives of giving citizenship rights to African Americans. That's a whole other step even beyond freeing the slaves, right? Is giving them full citizenship rights. And so clearly that wasn't accepted by many of the Southern reps. And then also women. That generation seems by today's standards to have been a bit misogynistic and not ready to even seriously consider the citizenship of women. And then Native Americans. What about the Native Americans that at least choose to assimilate and live amongst and like the white men? Would they take at least a stand on that? But what about the natives that stayed within their own tribal organizations? So notice what they did is you don't have an explicit statement on this, but it's indirectly stated when it talks about counting, right? Counting the state population of citizens in deciding how many reps they get in the House of Reps, and then also in deciding how much they are to be taxed. And it states in there that it's not counting, quote, Indians, and it's not counting people under labor contracts or other persons, right, referred to as slaves. So at any rate, that was a pragmatic or conservative decision as well, as they decided to go ahead and let each state decide for itself who could be citizens and who could not. So again, right, with pragmatic, it's making some type of a compromise for practical results, but you're not being moral about it. You're not looking at what ethically might be right or wrong. You're just trying to bring about practical results and getting this Constitution passed, getting the Southern states to accept it, etc. Perhaps another example of pragmatic was the combination. It's known as federalism, right? We have a federal republic. Is the idea of the states having some powers and the government, the central government in DC having other powers and them sharing powers as well. So Article 1, Section 8, it gives explicit powers to Congress. So now no longer can the states coin their own money, make treaties with other countries, regulate interstate trade, right? Raise an army, declare war. They can't do any of that stuff, right? But the 10th Amendment says whatever was not explicitly given to Congress, nor covered by the necessary and proper clause. And I would make an aside on that. That's very conservative, saying, well, in the future, right? What if Congress needs to do something that we didn't put on this list? Let's give them a way out, right? And say also that whatever is necessary and proper to do one of those things on that list, they can do. And you'll see quickly they're going to do that with a central bank, because they'll say, wait a minute, we don't see on the list in Article 1, Section 8 that Congress can make a bank, a national bank. And they said, well, it's necessary and proper in order to do this and that. I don't want to name that because we're going to get into that in another week or so. I think literally next week. So at any rate, I'm sorry, I digress, but I went off on the conservative that, but whatever is not given explicitly to Congress and is not covered by that necessary and proper clause is reserved to the states. So nothing is said about police powers and fire departments, nothing said about education and school systems. So technically the 10th Amendment gives that over to the states to control. All right. So that might be considered pragmatic because some came in that were very adamant about states' rights, and some came in that were very adamant about having a strong central government at the expense of the state's powers. And so they compromised. So that might be considered subjectively pragmatic. Okay. Are there any questions so far?
No.
Okay. Is that a little clearer now, maybe, as far as what I'm asking of you?
Yeah, that's a lot clearer.
Okay, good. I hope so. I really hope so. So at any rate, what I want to cover a few things that I thought were kind of common themes that you find at the Constitutional Convention. And be sure you take the quiz too, okay? Chapter 6 quiz. I thought I had it published by Monday, and I don't know what happened, but I published it late last night again. So it should be on there. Also due Sunday night. So let's see here. So for one, as far as general conclusions or themes that I subjectively see in reading about the Constitutional Convention, one is that a lot of a lot of the founding fathers who joined this convention seem to agree to a somewhat consensus that the Confederation was insufficient. Right? That's kind of being obvious. Uh, there there's evidence, like you did in the last assignment, of chaos happening within the states and between the states. So, for instance, even George Mason, who wrote the original um, Bill of Rights in the state of Virginia. That was before we wrote a national Bill of Rights. And some people say, you look at the verbiage of it, Thomas Jefferson borrowed a lot from his phrasing and his ideas. George Mason was known to be liberal, to be on the left. And let me say this now. During the French Revolution, when the Gironde were controlling the revolution before the Jacobins gained control, the Jacobins and others who were seen to be the most radical in the French Revolution historically sat on the left end chambers, the left part of the chambers. And they wanted radical change from the past, from tradition, from having a monarchy, etc., from having an aristocracy. So hence they're considered the left. And those who wanted to retain as much as possible from French traditions and the monarchy, the aristocracy, they happen to sit on the right. And the name has stuck to this day. So when I say on the left, I mean people who wanted to really bring about radical changes from the past, from British history, and those who sat on the right were more in tuned and in agreement with much of the British system. Okay, so even people like George Mason and James Wilson and Edmund Randolph, they were far to the left in their adamant demand for popular sovereignty. They wanted to make sure that in this republic, the democratic elements to this republic were the heaviest, were the strongest. They wanted to make sure that as many offices as possible could be elected and be accountable to the people. Even they agreed, George Mason, James Wilson, and Edmund Randolph, that they needed to give a new central government more power than a central government had had during the Confederation. Okay, so but however, there was a lot of trepidation. There was a lot of fear about this, right? Remember, like we talked about the social contract. Like, okay, here we go. I grudgingly agree that we need to elect about 12 of us to be our leaders, but I have a lot of fears about this, right? And so you had a guy named Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, and he came up and gave a speech and said that he was worried that they were going to give too much power to the central government and it was going to make a slave of the states and deprive them of all their sovereignty, of all their autonomy or their independence, right? He was worried about that. Roger Sherman of Delaware and the Connecticut delegates, so especially those in the small states, were especially concerned about this and seemed to have been further on the left, and that they wanted an enlightened, democratic, decentralized government as much as possible, right? So then you had men more further on the right, okay, who were more old school and traditional in what they wanted. And so let me just give you a couple names, okay? One was John Dickinson. John Dickinson said there was more trouble, there was more of a fear that states could take away our liberties than the central government. And we needed to make a big, strong central government. James Madison, who wrote most of the Constitution, a quiet, small guy who was very, he was kind of a paradox. A lot of people they contended that he wasn't the type of guy to throw his weight around. He was very unassuming and bashful, but yet he was very influential, kind of behind the scenes and in his writings at this convention. And James Madison, right, who will end up becoming a president during the War of 1812, he writes that Congress should have a negative, that was a term he used. Congress shall have the power, a negative power over the states, so that when the states make laws, Congress can supervise it and look at those laws and decide if those laws are, quote, improper. Now, we don't have that, do we? So some states to this day can have some bizarre laws to this day, and the central government stays out of it because we didn't go that far as Madison wanted. What we decided, right, is the Constitution is the ultimate authority, right? Kind of a combination of popular sovereignty of what the people want, ultimately, because the people ratified or approved of the Constitution, and then secondly, the Constitution itself is the law of the land. So hence, Congress can decide if a state law is unconstitutional and abrogate it, do away with it, but not simply because they think it's improper. So we ended up didn't not going that far. But with Madison, he wanted that much power to the central government that they could say no to any law of any state just simply because they thought it was, quote, improper rather than unconstitutional. He also wanted a single executive. And of course, we got that, right? But boy, the term that they use and a lot of times in the history books is solemn silence. When he brought this up, actually, it wasn't him, it was someone else, but someone else first stood up and said that he recommended that we have a single executive. It got deathly quiet in the chambers because we had just had a king, right, in George III. And when they thought, oh my goodness, what are we doing? Because what if we end up having a king with just another name? He's a king, but we happen to call him president, right? But that was balanced again by what I mentioned at first, is that there was knowledge that we need to have more law and order in these states and in this union, and we need to have a stronger central government against rebellions like Shays' Rebellion, right? And not to mention, they said all eyes furtively went toward George Washington as he was seated at the front, because everyone knew that he was going to play. They were going to give their consent to him being a part of an executive branch that would control and enforce the laws of the land. So there was this great respect and esteem for George Washington and wanting him to be a strong executive. But again, there was fear, right? That either he, or even if he had the self-restraint to be a good president, that what about future presidents, right? And the latitude that we give that position, that some presidents in the future might abuse that power. So hence, Madison wanting a single executive literally quieted the convention. People were very reticent, very hesitant about that, but it eventually prevailed. And also, he talked about filtration or filters, right? As he said that, and this in one way or another is probably on the test, okay, is that to conservatives, right, they could say that, okay, I believe in the inherent equality under the law of all people. And what do they mean by under the law? That as human beings, they ought to have the government protect their rights, their liberties, their prerogatives, their privileges, and their opportunities. That all people equally ought to be entitled to that under the law, although they were hypocritical, obviously, and only allowing the states to decide who was entitled to that, right? And they were only giving it to white property owning men. But at any rate, with that idea, right, they said, however, and I'm going to use kind of a modern examples that might be poor, but not everyone is equally capable of writing a good English paper. Not everyone is equally capable of fixing your automobile, right? Or playing a sport. And so hence nature, the conservative said, is not fair, or God, right? And that some people have been allocated by nature with better qualities, with more talents than others have, right? And so to them, they wanted this natural aristocracy, this natural group of the best to be chosen as the leaders, right? And so I think of it also like with sports, how fans can vote on all stars. They're saying, right, We don't care if you possess even a modicum of athleticism as a fan. We trust that you can see athleticism in other people and value it. And so, likewise, right, to Madison and the conservatives, they say, we don't trust that you as a common person could rule well, but we trust that you can see a good ruler, that you could recognize a good ruler when you see one. Okay. And a lot of this, like I said, is very conservative, right? To me, it reminds me of Plato's Republic when he talked about how there ought to be this school system, this universal school system, and the kids who stand out as being the brightest, being the most intelligent, and also by nature being the most uh, uh, virtuous, right? Kids that will share their graham crackers and chocolate milk with other students. I say half jokingly. Uh, Kids that seem to stand out from the other kids, right? And being good people morally and being intelligent and capable intellectually. So those kids, right, are siphoned off and separated from the rest of the kids, and they go through a three-tiered system of schooling through academia, through a college education, right? And they are prepared to rule over the very kids when they become 35, I think it was, or 30. They come back and rule over the very kids they were separated from. So to the founding fathers, they thought by nature, some people are inherently more capable of leading, and they ought to be the ones that the citizens vote for, right? And then also to compound that, they believed that many of those people, even though we didn't separate and have a system of schooling, although Jefferson wanted this from reading his Plato, it never came to pass, right? But here's another very conservative, elitist, arguable um, contention is they thought that a lot of the best and brightest are not going to be found amongst the most poor. So a lot of the best and brightest are going to be found in the middle and upper class, because in generations past, that intelligence that they have and virtue was in the DNA of their grandparents, and those grandparents did something with themselves and gave themselves a better life and got them out of poverty. But the argument is that those kids now, a lot of the brightest, have the luxury of leisure and education. And leisure, right? I don't mean to be able to just enjoy themselves with free time, but I mean the chance to classically educate themselves, read the Greco-Roman classics. Because remember, that was an argument that doesn't hold sway too well today, but amongst the founding fathers, is that a Greco-Roman education will open your eyes. It will broaden your horizons. It will make a broader, more cosmopolitan human being out of you. And it will also even morally make you a better person. I remember my small Catholic school that I went to for college, they tried to emulate that, and we had to read the Greco-Roman classics. And there was a lot on virtue with Aristotle and others, right? Virtue and friendship and happiness, etc. And so they were very broad topics. So the idea was, right, is they believed there already existed a cream of the crop, so to speak, right, that existed, and they ought to be the ones that are elected. And when they are elected, right, they ought to serve as filters. They ought to decide, okay, a lot of these decisions that my constituents that voted for me want are not sound. They won't bring about long-term good results economically, socially, politically, right? And so hence I'm going to filter that poor idea away and not even try to bring it up in Congress. But however, this idea they have, this seems sound according to my intelligence, my education, etc. So I'm going to run with this idea of theirs. And they
Well,
called
what
it
about George Washington though? Because didn't he have like no education?
good. They're absolutely right. But what I would say to that, right, is for one, that was the one area in which George Washington, supposedly, according to the primary sources, was actually self-deprecating in. He didn't even pretend to put on airs. In fact, he demonstrated his feelings of inferiority in when it came to education, and so it was kind of conceded by him as well as by others that he should not be a lawmaker, that the lawmakers in Congress, right, that he should not run for Congress, that the congressmen ought to be the best and brightest because they're the ones who come up with the laws. But and so hence for him, right, it was more appropriate to them that he be an executive, because the executive doesn't have to think creatively of laws, right? The executive just has to carry out the laws that have been made already by Congress. And so with his military background, he'll be perfect in doing that particular job and enforcing the laws, right? With his military good reputation. Did I answer that okay?
Yeah.
Because that's a good question, and you're absolutely right. But yeah, George Washington was admittedly very insecure about his lack of education and very intimidated by people like Madison and Jefferson, who were very well read and articulate, etc. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So the idea is that I'm talking about with elitism, right? I'm namely talking about Congress, those who make the laws, according to Madison and Hamilton and the conservatives. And so the term they used was, in Andrea Sierra, I wrote your name down, hun. So I have three now, Amanda, Amber, and Andrea for extra credit. So at any rate, the idea was stewardship. And with me, stewardship, I think of babysitters, right? You entrust something that is sacred to you to someone when you're not around to see how that person takes care of it, right? And so to them, they thought that the elected reps ought to be stewards, that they ought to be trusted with their intelligence, with their education, right? And their fine qualities and their leisure and so forth, to be able to be successful and better at what they're doing than their constituents who elected them are. And so hence they ought to be trusted. The liberals disagreed with this, right? And they said, no, 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 that's given too much power and lack of accountability to your elected reps. You don't want to just elect them and say, okay, do what you think is deemed best, right? Because to Jefferson and Patrick Henry and the liberals of that time period, more to the left, they said that's too dangerous, and they were against this. But it seemed to prevail nevertheless. But to them, right, the term they used as opposed to stewardship was mouthpiece. They said, no, our elected rep needs to merely be a mouthpiece. He needs to see exactly what his constituents who elected him want, and he's to put forth those propositions only, that he is only to serve as their mouthpiece. But not so to the conservatives, okay? They thought they were more elitist, right, and kind of snobbish about who ought to rule. So any questions on that as far as those to the right? All right. Now those to the left, like I said, they wanted more power to the states and not have too strong of a national Congress and national government. They were very concerned about tyranny from Washington, D.C., more than they were about tyranny from their own states, right? And they were concerned about tyranny from one executive, to be sure, right? I think it was Randolph who said his concern that the president might become the fetus of the monarch, right? That the king might have given birth to his natural son, a president, who would be no different, but only different in name only. So at any rate, they were worried about tyranny from the unelected offices, those who were well educated and so forth, because they disagreed that a classical education will necessarily make you a better politician. To them, right, a crook who gets a PhD in economics is just going to become a more effective crook, right? That he won't necessarily become a better person or more trustworthy. He's just going to become much more adept, more skillful, more knowledgeable in how to pull one over the people. And so to them, they were more concerned about tyranny from above, right? Whereas opposed to the right, they were concerned about tyranny from the many, right? Tyranny of the majority. And that comes from Aristotle and other writers, right? Who were very elitist in writing that the average person is led by, remember we kind of covered this in number 1 in last week's assignment, that the average person is led by his or her appetite or his Freudian id, right? Or in Christianity, they call it the flesh, right? Whatever it is that you just instinctively want, that the average person lacks proper self-control. and just goes after what he or she wants in the short run without thinking about how profitable that decision will be for other people and in the long run. So my argument, however, that I want to also mention that I think is that, to me, what was bittersweet and is still bittersweet is the fact that on the political spectrum of proverbial left and right, I think that our spectrum is not very broad. You look at Europe, for instance, right? You have people who want um, something like syndicalism, syndicalism. That is, the common people democratically in every location, right? They democratically decide how all resources are allocated. They decide on all laws politically and no outside intervention, right? And so if they want to collectively do away with private property and have people share it according to need, right, as a derivative of Marxism or communism, they can do that, right? Um, you have also anarchists, also on the left in Europe, who want to absolutely do away with government and have just equal allocation of all property. I think of John Lennon's song "Imagine." Everyone, no government, everyone sharing everything, living in harmony, right? That kind of hippie commune type of communism. You have that in the left in Europe, right? So to me, that's very far to the left. And then you have, right, uh, almost kind of neo-fascism to the right, where people want a strong militaristic government, one man leader who charismatically leads and is not even limited by constitution as far as what he or she can do. That's very far to the right, right? And so you have a broad spectrum in Europe. But here amongst the founding fathers, I would subjectively, argumentatively make the argument that the spectrum was not that broad. So, for instance, those to the left, they wanted states' rights. They wanted the republic to be heavier in democracy, right? And have the democratically elected offices be the strongest. But they too agreed, including Thomas Jefferson, oftentimes their spokesman, that he said that he agreed in a debate with John Adams that he thought that the majority of people will oftentimes get things wrong as far as policies or laws to be made for the same reasons that the conservatives believe, that the average people are not intelligent enough, they're not educated enough, they've not been given the education and leisure to look into things and study them and prepare themselves for the position. And so to him, right, he kind of likened democracy as a lesser evil only, right? That to him, his main fear was tyranny. And he thought, I would rather have tyranny from the majority than tyranny from one man or a few aristocratic people, right? And so to me, that's not very far to the left as far as his low estimation of the capacity of the common man and what the common people could or would do. And he too agreed that the popular legislator in the House that are elected by citizens ought to be, there ought to be checks and balances over them. He was okay with a Senate that was not directly elected that had to approve of the House's laws. He was okay with the president once the president was established because he didn't want a one-man executive. But once the president was there, he was okay with the president being able to veto what the House passes. Again, because he thought that oftentimes people will be rash and make foolish and selfish decisions. So to me, that's not very far to the left. He's not very democratic by today's standards. Like syndicalism, putting everything, including allocation of resources, in the hands of the common people. He was nowhere near that far to the left. Also, what about universal citizenship? Did the men on the left want universal citizenship? Without exception, no. No one seriously pushed, at least not Jefferson, and not Patrick Henry, and not Edmund Randolph. They did not push for enfranchising or giving citizenship inclusion to African Americans. Matter of fact, they adhered to the Sambo image, and Jefferson is going to have some racist writings and saying that he believed that Black people were, see, because Benjamin Franklin was more progressive, and he said, I think Black people are behind only because of their circumstances. That if they hadn't been enslaved, that had they been educated, that they could be as capable as any other human being. But that was very anomalous, out of the ordinary. He stood out like a sore thumb. Thomas Jefferson and the other liberals said, no, no, we think Black people are inherently, by nature, biologically, inferior in their intellect to white people. Yikes, right? That's not very far to the left. And so, and not to mention, a lot of those on the left were okay with slavery, at least as a compromise for the time being. So much for the left being that far on the spectrum, right? Then you go to the right, Madison and Hamilton, right? Wilson and these other guys who wanted a real strong central government. They were okay with more politicians being unelected than elected. They wanted those even who were elected to be filters and to be better than the people that were electing them, right? But they still wanted a House of properly elected congressmen, of House reps. And they still wanted it to have its powers that it had, to be able to override a presidential veto, right? To be able to impeach a president. They were for the properly elected House having those powers. They did not oppose that. They also, like Hamilton, many of them actually, or not many of them, but some of them, even on the far right, were abolitionists and fought. And Madison himself, which is hypocritical because he was a slave owner, but went up there and talked about during the convention how unjust, inequitable, and immoral slavery was. And these are the dudes on the right, and they're the ones speaking against slavery, right? So to me, right, they still wanted a mixed government of some elected offices, some unelected offices with checks and balances. They still wanted on the right a constitution, right? And the constitutional to be supreme, so that if the president or anyone did something that was deemed by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional, that it would be abrogated, it would be done away with, and they would be held accountable by a written constitution. So much for thinking of the right as being like fascists, right? And so that's my take on it, is I believe that them being very very moderate. The liberals not that liberal of the time period. The conservatives not that conservative. In the short run, to me, it's going to help. It's going to help bring about a more peaceful government, so that they can compromise and say, fine, we'll allow slavery at least for now, right? And so they could come together more easily because their differences really aren't that distinctive, right? They're not really that far apart on the political spectrum. Also, when they run for office, so for instance, when John Adams runs against Thomas Jefferson, the left says, don't vote for John Adams. He's going to reinstitute a monarchy and bring us back to a union with Great Britain, right? The right says, don't vote for Thomas Jefferson. He's going to bring about a Jacobin-like French Revolution, in which, right, the Jacobins declare class warfare in France, and they began beheading noblemen simply for being noble, right, and getting rid of the aristocracy, literally killing and beheading thousands of French nobles. But to me, right, when John Adams beats Jefferson in 1796, Jefferson sits back and says, fine, I'll wait 4 more years to 1800. And he accepts that peaceful transition of power. In 1800, Jefferson beats John Adams. John Adams is sour and bitter, but he steps down and says, fine. And he accepts Jefferson from 1800 to 1808. And the conservatives bided their time. To me, it's because I think, and at least one reason, is that their rhetoric during the campaigns was hyperbole. It was staged. What's the word I'm thinking? Strategic exaggeration, and they didn't really believe it themselves. And deep down, they knew that the left and right were really not that far apart as compared to like Europe. And so to me, it helps us have peaceful transitions of power. When the liberals or conservatives win, the others just bite their lip, bide their time, and wait for re-election time. But when you look in Latin America, right, beneath us and other areas, I would argue that the left was way further to the left and the right was way further to the right than on the American political spectrum. So hence, when one side won, it did actually seem more like the end of the world, like a nightmare, like everything was at stake and that they could not accept the election results. And so hence they had more coups and revolutions and civil wars and people refusing to step down after they lost an election and fighting, right? So in the short run, I think our political spectrum being relatively narrow was good because it helped them compromise on things and agree to a government and have peaceful transitions of power, right? Especially as we economically developed and became kind of a super giant of a nation. That was good. But you look to the future Civil War. You look to the future civil rights movement. You look at what's going on right now. You can make the argument that them being so close on the spectrum kept them from dealing with fundamental things that they just kept kicking the can down the road, like slavery, like citizenship rights and equal rights for all human beings, right? They wouldn't address that. They kicked that can down the road for future generations to have to deal with. So in the long run, it had a price tag, I think, and that's my soapbox on the issue. So are there any questions?
No.
Okay. So really, that's about it. Those are the major things that are on the test. I hope that I've helped you a little bit as far as my expectations on this assignment that's due this Sunday. You guys feel better about the assignment?
Yeah, I do.
Good. I hope so, Amanda. Anybody else? Any questions or comments? All right. Well, I think for now, that'll do it for this week, okay? So again, I have your names for extra credit. Thank you, ladies, for attending. I will put this on. It usually takes about an hour for me to download the darn video. But once that happens and I'm able to record it, and I also have another Zoom in about an hour. So it might be later this afternoon, but sometime today and later today, I'll have this recorded on Canvas for everyone to watch. So please watch it. And you guys have a good week, okay? I'm proud of you guys. I'm genuinely impressed by the argumentative assignments that I'm reading. And you guys are doing well on catching on to my unique style of my quirky style of teaching. And we're about halfway through the semester already in week 8. All right, so you guys have a good week, okay? And if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and say adieu.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Are you still gonna talk to me?
Amber, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just
Sorry
wanted to
about
make
that.
sure.
I'm glad you reminded me.
I don't know if you want to stop recording or I don't know.
Yeah, you know what I'll do is I'll edit it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll edit this out.
Okay. Well, I had emailed you last week about assignment number 5
Sure.
because I was having some personal issues and I missed the assignment.
Okay.
And so I had asked if I could have like gotten an extension or like what had happened if I turned it in late, because for some reason I just couldn't find where late work was.
Sure.
But I figured it out, but sadly I figured it out after the week was up.
Uh-huh.
Like the time period that you had to like redo it, I guess.
Sure.
So I don't know.
That's okay, hon. Yeah, I'm fine with that. So I, especially because you emailed me and informed me of your situation, go ahead and even if you still haven't yet, go ahead and submit that, and I will ignore the late late notice on my end.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I missed like 3 things because also I don't think Canvas is really my friend right now. That or it's just confusing because I try to do everything week by week just because of how my brain works.
Sure.
But for some reason, when things show up as assignments, they don't show up in my modules, and I don't know why that is.
Yeah.
So I usually check the modules, therefore I miss assignments.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Why don't you meet me halfway? Uh, uh, First of all, try to see, even to the point of calling someone at MJC. Try to look into it in your end as to why that's not happening. Because for other people, it seems to be okay as far as what's showing up. Um, and then also use Canvas Message if you don't mind to
Okay.
communicate with me. And if I have to, whenever I have to, and you letting me know via a Canvas message, I can message you back and I could send it. I should be able to. I should be able to send the assignment as an attachment to you. So I could personally send you the assignment if need be.
Okay. I mean, I'll take full responsibility for the missed assignment and the missed test. I was just wondering about the argument assignment number 5 because I had emailed you about that one.
Yeah. So yeah,
So
absolutely. Don't worry about assignment number 5. I will. You just turn that into me as soon as you can. Submit that, and I will ignore it being late, and I won't deduct any points.
okay.
Okay. So yeah, try to look into it on your end to see what's going awry, and if you're trying and it's still not showing up or still not clear, just Canvas message me, and if need be, like I said, I'll respond and try to send the assignment itself to you personally via an attachment.
Okay.
Okay.
Alrighty. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So yeah, just keep in touch with me with Canvas message, and we'll deal with things as they pop up. That's what I'm
Okay.
here for. Okay.
Alrighty.
All right, Amber. Nice to meet you, and have a good day. Okay.
You too.
Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.